She had 3 days before the boarding house owner sold her trunk for unpaid rent. The baby asleep against her shoulder was not hers by blood, though nobody in Dry Creek cared enough to ask the difference. The rancher who stopped beside her outside the church looked at the child first, then at the bruise hidden beneath her glove, and said nothing for a long moment. What followed began as an arrangement built from debt, drought, and exhaustion. This is a story about two people who believed survival meant carrying every burden alone until a child neither expected forced them to learn otherwise. The surrender paper blurred beneath Evelyn Pierce's hand before the preacher finished speaking. The church stayed cold despite the June heat outside. Drafts slid beneath the doors and touched the hem of her dress like creek water. The baby stirred against her chest beneath a faded blue blanket that smelled faintly of sour milk. "You understand what you're signing?" the preacher asked. Evelyn nodded once. Mrs. Greeley from the orphan committee stood beside the altar holding a ledger against her ribs. Lavender powder and starch clung to her clothes. "It's the practical choice," she said. "You have no husband, no steady income. The child deserves proper placement before winter." Placement, as though Lily were freight. Evelyn swallowed hard. "I know what she deserves. Then you know this is necessary." The church doors opened before Evelyn answered. Heavy boots crossed the aisle. Every head turned. Caleb Mercer removed his hat near the front pews. Dust covered his coat. Sweat darkened the collar of his shirt from the ride. He looked exactly like the stories people whispered through town lately. Ranch failing, mortgage due. Foreman vanished with payroll money. A man hanging onto land through pride alone. The preacher cleared his throat. "Mr. Mercer." Caleb's eyes moved across the room, once before settling on the paper in Evelyn's hand. Then the child. "What's this?" "Private business," Mrs. Greeley answered. "Looks public enough." No anger in his voice. That made it worse. Evelyn lowered her eyes to the paper again. If she looked at him too long, she might not finish signing. Lily stirred harder against her chest. Caleb stepped closer. Sun warmed leather and dust came off him with the heat of the afternoon. "Whose child?" "Mine now," Evelyn said quietly. The preacher shifted awkwardly. "Miss Pierce has cared for the infant since her sister died during childbirth." Caleb's jaw tightened slightly. Evelyn signed anyway. The pen scratched hard enough to tear the page. Lily began crying immediately. Mrs. Greeley reached for her. Evelyn did not let go. Only 2 seconds, long enough for Caleb Mercer to notice. "Stop." The room went silent. Mrs. Greeley blinked. "Excuse me?" Caleb looked at Evelyn. "You trying to give her up? She deserves better than a rented room and watered soup." "That's not what I asked." Heat climbed Evelyn's throat. "I can't keep her." Lily hiccuped softly against her shoulder. Caleb studied Evelyn for another long moment, measuring. Then he looked toward the preacher. "Marriage record still kept here?" Mrs. Greeley laughed sharply. "Surely you aren't suggesting I wasn't speaking to you?" Silence settled over the church again. The preacher stared. Mr. Mercer Caleb kept his eyes on Evelyn. "You need a roof. You don't know me." "No, but I know what happens to children sent east from towns like this." Mrs. Greeley stiffened. "Those homes are respectable." "Some are." The way he said it told Evelyn enough. "You need help on your ranch?" she asked carefully. His gaze sharpened slightly. "Yes?" "So you're marrying for convenience. You're signing papers either way today." Blunt, honest. Outside, wagon wheels rattled along the dry road. Inside, everyone waited. "What's the arrangement? You get the house. The child stays with you. I keep the ranch running long enough to save it. And after?" A pause. "After depends on whether it works. Not tender, but honest." Evelyn looked at him fully then. Exhaustion sat beneath the hardness in his face, the look of a man carrying too much alone. "What's your stake in this?" "The bank gives me until the first snowfall to settle the mortgage." There it was. Truth. They were both drowning. The preacher removed his spectacles slowly. "Marriage is not necessary?" Caleb interrupted. "Seems necessary enough from where I'm standing." Mrs. Greeley scoffed. Caleb looked at her once. "You got another solution?" She said nothing. Evelyn looked down at Lily again. A tiny fist curled against the blanket. 3 days until eviction, no family left, no work offered to women carrying babies. "If we do this," she said quietly, "the child stays with me always." Caleb nodded. "And I work. I won't sit in your kitchen pretending gratitude." "Fine. You don't use her against me." Something hardened in his expression then. "Wouldn't?" The answer came too fast to be false. The preacher sighed heavily. "Miss Pierce, are you certain?" "No, but certainty belonged to people with choices." Evelyn kissed Lily's forehead once, then she looked at Caleb Mercer. "All right." The ranch looked worse up close. Fence posts leaned crooked along the pasture. Half the grass had been grazed nearly to dirt. The barn roof sagged badly on one side. Caleb drove in silence, while the evening wind carried the smell of dry grass and distant rain across the plains. Evelyn appreciated the silence more than she expected. By the time they reached the house, dusk had turned the windows copper beneath the setting sun. Caleb climbed down first. He did not offer his hand. Evelyn did not wait for one. A young ranch hand emerged from the barn carrying a lantern. His eyes widened. "You actually did it." Caleb took the baby satchel from the wagon. "Thomas. Sorry." The boy failed not to stare at Evelyn's wedding ring. Plain silver. Bought from the church donation box less than an hour earlier. "Horses fed?" Caleb asked. "Yes, sir." Caleb. "Then, quit gawking." Thomas disappeared toward the barn. The front door stuck halfway before Caleb shoved harder against it. Inside smelled faintly of cold ashes and stale coffee. Sparse, functional, lonely. Ledger books covered the kitchen table. Dust lined the windowsills. Caleb set the satchel near the stairs. Room at the end of the hall. "You sleep where?" "Down here mostly." He removed his coat slowly. "Depends how late bookkeeping runs." Evelyn glanced at the ledgers automatically. Feed costs, payroll, debt. She recognized desperation when it was written down. Lily whimpered softly. "She needs warm milk." Caleb pointed toward the pantry. Condensed tins somewhere. Somewhere. Evelyn nearly smiled. Instead, she crossed to the cupboards. 3 minutes later, she understood exactly how close the ranch sat to collapse. Flour nearly gone. Coffee stretched thin, salt pork low. Behind her, Caleb spoke without looking up. "You can leave if you want." Evelyn paused. "I signed papers." "Doesn't mean I'll hold you here?" "You think that's what concerns me?" "No idea what concerns you." That honesty again. She warmed milk carefully over the stove while Lily fussed against her shoulder. "What happened to your foreman?" Caleb's pen stopped moving. "Left." "With payroll money?" "Yes." "And the bank?" "Wants the land." Short answers. Tight answers. Like words cost him effort. Lily settled once the bottle reached her mouth. Evelyn glanced toward the ledgers again. "Your feed calculations are wrong." Caleb looked up sharply. "You're accounting against the projected herd instead of surviving headcount." His expression cooled. "You read ranch books?" "My father traded cattle." "And?" "You're overestimating winter costs by $40. Silence. Then Caleb pushed a ledger toward her. "Show me." Challenge clear in his voice. Evelyn crossed to the table carrying Lily and sat carefully. Dust clung to the pages. She scanned the figures quickly. "There." Caleb leaned closer, too close suddenly. "You counted 12 dead cattle twice, once in March, again in April transfer totals." His brow furrowed. "And your grain supplier kept the old freight rate after winter tariff changes." "You sure?" "Yes." "How?" "My husband drank himself into debt before he died. Somebody had to keep creditors from taking the house." The words landed flat between them. Caleb looked away first. A quieter silence settled after that, less hostile, still cautious. Outside, thunder rolled closer. "You hungry?" Caleb asked. "There's stew," he added. "Probably terrible." That almost sounded like humor. Almost. By the fourth morning, Evelyn knew which floorboards creaked loudest beneath shifting weight and which cupboard door needed lifting before it would close properly. She knew the kitchen windows stuck whenever humidity rose overnight. She knew the pump outside groaned twice before clean water finally surged through the pipe. She knew which ranch hands removed their hats politely around her and which one still looked uncertain what to call the woman Caleb Mercer had married without warning. More than anything, she knew Caleb barely slept. She noticed because Lily woke before sunrise most mornings, hungry and restless in the dim blue hour before dawn. Every time Evelyn carried the baby downstairs, wrapped in a blanket, Caleb already sat at the kitchen table fully dressed with the oil lamp burning low beside open ledgers. Always working, always calculating loss. Some mornings his coffee sat untouched and cold beside his elbow. Other mornings he stared so long at the numbers that he seemed not to hear anyone enter the room at all. The ranch felt like a man holding his breath. Thomas hovered nearby constantly under the excuse of chores, chopping wood, cleaning tack, carrying feed sacks that did not need carrying yet. Mostly he drifted toward Lily whenever possible. "She smiles more at me," he complained one morning while the baby gripped his finger stubbornly. "Evelyn kneaded biscuit dough across the counter. That's because you make ridiculous faces at her." Thomas looked genuinely offended. Babies appreciate effort. From the table, Caleb said dryly, "Doubtful." Thomas grinned despite himself. The sound lingered strangely in the kitchen afterward. The ranch no longer sounded entirely empty. Evelyn tried not to notice that either. Morning light slowly spread across the floorboards while biscuit flour dusted her hands white. Lily sat bundled in a basket near the stove, making soft, sleepy sounds. "Miller came by yesterday," Caleb said suddenly. Evelyn glanced over her shoulder. Harold Miller owned the bank carrying the ranch mortgage and half the fear in Dry Creek besides. What did he want? Caleb shut the ledger harder than necessary. What he always wants. Money. Silence stretched briefly between them while wind scraped dry grass against the porch outside. Finally, Caleb leaned back in the chair and rubbed one tired hand across his jaw. "He says if payments don't improve before September, he takes half the south pasture." Thomas stopped moving near the stove. Evelyn wiped flour from her hands slowly. "How much short are you?" "Enough." That answer told her plenty by itself. She crossed toward the table and held out her hand. "Show me." Caleb hesitated, not because he doubted her intelligence. That much she already sensed. Pride caused the pause instead. Men like Caleb Mercer carried failure privately until it buried them. After several long seconds, he slid the ledger across the table. Evelyn sat down beside the lamp and scanned the columns carefully. Payroll losses, drought damage, feed costs, veterinary medicine, freight charges. Then she stopped. "You're paying too much for medicine." Caleb frowned immediately. The herd got sick. Yes, because the West Trench collapsed. Evelyn traced one column with her finger. The creek water stagnated. Thomas blinked. "How'd you know that?" "My father lost 23 head during a drought season exactly the same way." She looked toward Caleb again. "You treated the fever instead of fixing the source." Something unreadable crossed his expression. "How would you know anything about trench systems? My father traded cattle across 3 counties before he died." Evelyn closed the ledger softly. "You learn quickly when survival depends on it." A pause settled over the room. Then Caleb asked quietly, "You know trench repair?" "No." Evelyn rose from the chair again. "But I know how to organize labor." That afternoon, hot wind rolled across the west pasture, hard enough to sting exposed skin with dust. Evelyn walked beside Thomas through brittle yellow grass, while Lily slept wrapped securely against her chest beneath a light cloth. The trench looked worse up close. Silt nearly choked the entire channel. Green, stagnant water pooled thick beneath the heat while flies gathered along the muddy edges. "Mr. Mercer kept meaning to fix it," Thomas muttered. "Just never had enough hands." "He's been trying to save 5 disasters at once," Evelyn replied. Beyond the hill, thin cattle wandered slowly through grass cropped nearly to dirt. She made the decision immediately. "Get every shovel on the ranch," she said, "and find the Peterson boys if they want day wages." Thomas blinked. "You serious?" "Yes." By late afternoon, 6 men worked knee-deep in mud widening the trench walls, while fresh water finally rushed again from the upper creek. Sweat soaked Evelyn's collar and loosened strands of hair from her braid as she hauled rocks beside them. Mud streaked her skirt nearly black near the hem. Nobody argued with her after the first hour. Near dusk, hoofbeats sounded across the pasture. Caleb rode in from town and slowed immediately at the sight before him. Thomas straightened from the trench. Miss Evelyn said stagnant water's killing the herd. Caleb dismounted slowly without taking his eyes off the work. You organized this? Yes. You paid workers? With my savings. His head turned sharply then. You had money? Enough. Silence. Wind moved softly through the dry grass around them. Finally, Caleb asked, quieter this time. You spent it on my trench? Evelyn shoved another heavy rock loose into the mud. I spent it on the cattle feeding your mortgage. He stared at her another long moment. Then, without another word, Caleb removed his coat, climbed directly into the trench beside her, and started working. They stayed there until darkness swallowed the pasture whole. At one point, Evelyn slipped against the wet bank. Caleb caught her elbow before she fell. Neither moved immediately afterward. Rain finally came that night. Hard summer rain hammered the roof while wind rattled loose shutters. The smell of wet earth flooded through the kitchen window. Evelyn stood near the stove, rocking Lily while thunder rolled overhead. Caleb entered soaked through from securing the barn. You'll freeze, Evelyn said. Been colder. Still, she handed him a towel. He hesitated before taking it. Small gestures carried strange weight in that house. Lily reached tiny fingers toward him. Caleb froze visibly. She won't bite, Evelyn said. Thomas snorted near the stove. Probably. Caleb ignored him, but after a long moment, he offered one rough finger awkwardly toward the baby. Lily grabbed it immediately. Caleb went still. Thomas grinned. Well, she picked you. Something changed in Caleb's face then. Wonder. This is Dusty Vows, where stories like hers live. Women underestimated, men too stubborn to admit what they needed until it stood right in front of them. If you want the next story the moment it arrives, subscribe now. Then back to the ranch. 3 days later, Mrs. Greeley arrived uninvited. Her wagon rattled into the yard while ranch hands openly watched from the barn. Evelyn stood on the porch holding Lily against her hip. I heard rumors, Mrs. Greeley said stiffly. The town survives on them. The older woman's gaze lingered on Evelyn's wedding band. This arrangement cannot possibly be appropriate. The child is fed, housed, healthy, for now. Caleb emerged from the barn wiping grease from his hands. What does she want? The church committee remains concerned about the infant. Caleb glanced once at Lily. Looks concerned to you? Mrs. Greeley stiffened. A ranch under foreclosure is hardly stability. There it is, Thomas muttered from the barn. Evelyn ignored him. And an orphan train eastward is? Silence. You married a desperate man, Mrs. Greeley said. Yes. And expect society to respect it? That same society was ready to send her away. Mrs. Greeley turned toward Caleb. You truly intend to keep them here? That's the arrangement. And when the bank takes the ranch? Caleb's jaw tightened. Then they leave with whatever belongs to them. Evelyn looked at him sharply. The statement landed heavier than it sounded. After Mrs. Greeley finally left, Evelyn found Caleb repairing tack inside the barn near dusk. Warm animal heat filled the air along with leather oil and hay dust. You shouldn't have said that. Said what? That we'd leave with what belongs to us. You wanted me to say she'd stay here alone? No. Lantern light carved tired shadows beneath his eyes. Caleb threaded another strap carefully through a buckle. Truth matters. You think you'll lose the ranch. I think banks don't care about effort. Evelyn leaned against the stall door. Then we make them care about numbers instead. That finally pulled his attention fully toward her. You got a plan? Possibly. She crossed toward the workbench and laid several folded papers beside him. Your western boundary line is wrong. What? Legally. The county assessor recorded Mercer Creek as seasonal runoff instead of permanent water access. That lowers your grazing valuation. Meaning? Miller inflated your taxes illegally. Silence stretched, then Caleb stood slowly. You sure? Enough to bet the ranch. For the first time since the church, he looked at her differently. Not obligation. Possibility. A week later, the town watched them differently too. Evelyn noticed it first at the mercantile. Conversations quieted slightly when she entered carrying Lily beneath the summer heat pressing through the open windows. Old Mrs. Talbot, who once refused Evelyn credit at the boarding house, now nodded politely from the fabric counter. The grocer weighed beans behind the register. Heard Mercer fixed the west trench. We fixed it. The man nodded slowly. People respected survival differently once tied to a rancher's name. Evelyn disliked how true that was. She approached the register just as Harold Miller entered the store. Cigar smoke and expensive cologne clung to him. "Well," he drawled, "Mrs. Mercer now. Mr. Miller. You should be careful attaching yourself to sinking land. The ranch isn't sunk yet." "Not yet." He removed his gloves finger by finger. "Though your husband seems determined to delay reality, he works, he owes." The words came smooth as polished stone. Evelyn lowered her voice carefully. "Your tax assessments are inaccurate." That stopped him, only briefly. Then he laughed softly. "Caleb sent you to negotiate?" "I can read numbers on my own, a dangerous skill in a woman. She usually uses it for useful work." The mercantile went quiet. Caleb stood near the doorway, dusty from riding. Miller smiled thinly. "Mercer." Caleb crossed toward Evelyn without looking away from the banker. "You bothering my wife?" The word hit her unexpectedly hard. Wife. Simple. Practical. Still. "Conversation isn't bothering," Miller said. "Depends on the conversation." Silence tightened between them. Finally, Miller adjusted his gloves again. "You'll have papers by month's end." "And you'll have corrections attached," Caleb replied. Something flickered across the banker's face then. "Good." He left without another word. Only after the door shut did the sound slowly return to the store. Outside, heat shimmered above the dusty street while Caleb loaded supplies into the wagon. "You shouldn't go to town alone," he said finally. "There it is again." He glanced toward her. "What?" "That tone pretending you aren't worried." Caleb looked toward the road ahead. "The town's changing its mind about you. That trouble you?" "No." A pause. "Troubles other people." The wagon rattled slowly toward the ranch. "You defended me in there," Evelyn said. "You were handling yourself fine." "Still." His hands tightened once on the reins. "Didn't like the way he spoke to you." The words stayed with her the rest of the ride home. Near the ranch gate, Caleb spoke again. "Evelyn." The first time he had used her name. She looked toward him immediately. Something shifted in his expression. Then he only said, "Storm coming tonight." Thunder rolled across the plains as the wagon passed through the gate. The storm hit after midnight. Wind slammed against the house while rain lashed sideways across the windows, hard enough to wake Lily crying upstairs. Then came shouting outside. Male voices, angry. Evelyn reached the window first. Lantern light swung wildly near the barn. 3 riders, one carrying a torch. Downstairs, Caleb was already moving. She heard the shotgun lifted from beside the door before she saw him pulling on his coat. Stay inside. Caleb inside. Then he disappeared into the rain. Evelyn rushed upstairs long enough to settle Lily safely in the bedroom basket before grabbing her father's revolver from the trunk beneath the bed. Outside, chaos erupted. Thomas hit the mud hard after one rider shoved him. Another kicked apart feed barrels. Caleb stood 20 feet away, aiming the shotgun steadily through the rain. Nathan Miller smiled crookedly near the fence line. "The bank says property seizure begins tomorrow. You don't seize land at midnight with torches. Accidents happen." The torch moved toward dry hay. Everything happened fast after that. Caleb lunged. The shotgun fired. Horses screamed inside the barn while rain hissed against lantern flames. Evelyn saw the real danger immediately. The records, the mortgage papers beside the office stove. If those vanished, Miller kept the land. She ran inside. Wind slammed the front door hard enough to shake the walls. The office smelled sharply of lamp oil and wet ash. Evelyn grabbed every ledger she could carry just as glass shattered downstairs. One of the riders had entered the house. Heavy boots crossed the kitchen below, searching, not for money, for documents. Understanding hit instantly. The floorboard creaked beneath Evelyn's foot. The man looked up, then charged toward the stairs. Evelyn ran for the bedroom as the intruder thundered up behind her. She shoved the door shut, dragged the washstand against it, and grabbed the revolver while Lily screamed. The door splintered beneath another hit. Then silence, shouting downstairs, Caleb's voice. When Evelyn finally opened the bedroom door cautiously, the hallway smelled of rainwater, broken plaster, and gunpowder smoke. She stepped into the hall, gripping the revolver so tightly her fingers hurt. Downstairs, Caleb stood near the shattered kitchen window, pinning an unconscious man hard against the wall with one forearm across his throat. Rain blew sideways through broken glass behind him, scattering droplets across the floorboards. Mud streaked both men from the struggle. Blood ran steadily down Caleb's arm from a deep cut near the elbow. His breathing sounded rough. His eyes found Evelyn immediately. Not the revolver, not the ledgers still clutched against her chest. Her. "You hurt?" he asked sharply. Evelyn realized Lily was still crying upstairs behind her. The sound cut through the ringing in her ears. No. Caleb closed his eyes briefly and exhaled once hard through his nose. Relief. Fast and instinctive enough that he probably did not realize he had shown it. Thomas burst through the front doorway seconds later, soaked to the bone and breathing hard. "They ran," he said. Nathan took off toward the north road. Caleb nodded once without looking away from Evelyn. "Get rope." Thomas hurried again immediately. Only then did Evelyn notice Caleb's hand shaking slightly from blood loss and adrenaline. The sight unsettled her more than the storm, because until that moment, Caleb Mercer had seemed built from the same material as the ranch itself. Hard earth, drought wood, iron left too long beneath the weather, not human enough to bleed. Sheriff Collins arrived shortly after sunrise, smelling strongly of whiskey, damp wool, and irritation at being forced out before breakfast. The storm had weakened into a steady drizzle by then. Mud covered the yard. One barn lantern still swung crookedly in the morning wind. Collins climbed down from his horse slowly while studying the broken fence rail and shattered kitchen window. "Looks lively," he muttered. Thomas nearly exploded. "They tried burning the damn barn down. Watch your mouth. They could have killed us." The sheriff shrugged one shoulder. "Nobody dead." Caleb's expression darkened immediately. Evelyn stepped forward before the situation worsened. One of the men entered the house searching for documents. That caught Collins's attention. What documents? Without speaking, Evelyn crossed back inside and returned carrying the oilcloth bundle she had protected through the night. The ledgers remained dry despite the storm. She handed them over carefully. These prove Harold Miller altered tax assessments against Mercer Ranch for nearly 2 years. Collins frowned while flipping through several pages. His lips moved silently over freight numbers and acreage totals. "You certain?" "Yes." "How?" "The water access classification was falsified," Evelyn explained calmly. "Freight tariffs were inflated after winter rate reductions, and livestock losses were counted twice." The sheriff looked unconvinced at first, then slower, then uneasy. Caleb watched her the entire time. Not surprise anymore, not caution either, something steadier. Trust. Real trust. By afternoon, half the county had already heard some version of the story. Dry Creek survived on gossip almost as efficiently as cattle. By evening, neighboring ranch hands began arriving unasked with lumber, nails, and replacement hinges loaded into wagons. Men who barely acknowledged Caleb weeks earlier now repaired fence posts beside him without discussing payment first. People changed quickly once the truth had witnesses attached to it. Old Mrs. Talbot even appeared carrying 2 loaves of fresh bread wrapped carefully in cloth. "For the baby," she said stiffly, though everyone understood the bread was not only for Lily. Evelyn thanked her anyway. Near sunset, Clara Bennett arrived while Caleb sat at the kitchen table with his injured arm stretched beneath the lamplight. The kitchen smelled of rain-soaked denim, whiskey disinfectant, and fresh bread still cooling near the stove. Evelyn threaded another needle carefully while Caleb stared toward the wall with visible suspicion. "You're making that face again," she told him. "What face?" "The one pretending you aren't about to complain. I'm not complaining. You complained through the last 3 stitches, because you're sewing me together like saddle leather." From the doorway, Clara snorted softly. "You sewed him proper," she observed while removing wet gloves. Evelyn tied off another stitch. "He complained the entire time. Because she pulled thread through my arm, Caleb muttered. Means she plans to keep you alive, Clara replied. Thomas laughed hard enough to choke on his coffee. Caleb glared at him without much force behind it. The older woman leaned quietly against the doorway afterward, studying them all in silence. Her lined face softened slightly in the lantern glow. Some folks survive beside each other 20 years without becoming family, Clara said at last. Others do it inside a season. Nobody answered, but the silence felt different now. Warmer somehow. Outside, frogs sounded faintly from the refilled creek trench, while night settled slowly across the plains. Later, after Lily finally fell asleep upstairs, Evelyn found Caleb sitting alone on the porch steps. Cool air carried the scent of wet sagebrush and rain-soaked dirt through the dark. She sat beside him quietly. For a while, neither spoke. Then Caleb said, "You saved the records. You saved the house." Another silence followed, not uncomfortable anymore, the kind that settled naturally between tired people who no longer needed constant defenses. Finally, Caleb leaned forward against his knees. "You could have left weeks ago. So could you." "I had debt." Evelyn glanced sideways at him. "You had pride." That almost smile appeared again, small, real. Wind stirred softly through the pasture grass beyond the porch rail. After a long pause, Caleb spoke again, quieter this time. "Miller offered me a private deal before you came." Evelyn waited. He wanted South Pasture cheap, said he'd erase personal debt if I signed before foreclosure. And Caleb stared toward the dark field stretching beyond the barn. "I nearly did it." The honesty in his voice carried no self-pity, only exhaustion. "What stopped you?" His jaw tightened once before answering. "Didn't want my father's land ending with me." Evelyn looked down at his hands resting loosely together between his knees, scarred knuckles, cracked skin, hands worn raw trying to hold too much alone. Without really thinking about it, she rested her fingers lightly against his wrist, warm skin beneath rough calluses. Caleb went completely still. "He was wrong about you," she said softly. "Who? Whoever taught you needing help makes you weak." Something shifted across his face then, brief and unguarded enough that Evelyn almost looked away from it, but she didn't. Slowly, Caleb turned his hand beneath hers until their palms rested fully together. No dramatic movement, no speech, just choice, intentional and quiet. Then he said her name. Different this time, not formal, not careful. And they both heard the change immediately. "Tell me, did you feel that shift too, or was it only her? Leave your answer below." I read every comment. Now back to the story. 3 days later, the hearing filled the county office. Heat pressed through the crowded room despite every window standing open. Townspeople lined the walls, whispering behind gloved hands. Harold Miller sat rigid beside his attorney. Evelyn sat beside Caleb, not behind him, beside. Judge Whitmore adjusted his spectacles while reviewing the ledgers stacked before him. "These freight discrepancies are substantial." "Clerical misunderstandings," Miller said smoothly. "No," Evelyn replied calmly. "Intentional inflation." Several heads turned. The judge looked over his glasses. "You verified this personally?" "Yes." "You're qualified in property accounting?" Caleb spoke before she could. "She's qualified enough to save my ranch." The room fell silent. Miller laughed softly. "Your wife is an emotional investment speaking." "No," Caleb replied flatly. "Numbers are." That shut the banker up. Evelyn stepped forward and explained the errors one by one. Water access classification, double livestock losses, altered freight tariffs, precise, calm, impossible to dismiss. She had 3 days before the boarding house owner sold her trunk for unpaid rent. 3 days before the dresses folded carefully inside it, the framed photograph of her parents, and the few coins hidden beneath the false lining became somebody else's property. In Dry Creek, unpaid debts traveled faster than sympathy. People already looked through her instead of at her whenever she carried the baby through town. Nobody asked whether the child belonged to her by blood. Poverty erased those distinctions quickly. The baby slept against Evelyn Pierce's shoulder, beneath a faded blue blanket that smelled faintly of milk and wood smoke. Lily's tiny fist remained curled near Evelyn's collarbone even in sleep, stubborn in the way frightened children often were. Evelyn adjusted the blanket carefully while standing near the church doors, trying not to think about the paper waiting inside. What followed began as an arrangement built from debt, drought, and exhaustion, but neither of them understood that yet. Inside, the church stayed cold despite the June heat outside. Drafts slipped beneath the doors and touched the hem of Evelyn's dress like creek water. The surrender paper blurred slightly beneath her hand before the preacher finished speaking. "You understand what you're signing?" he asked gently. Evelyn nodded once because speaking felt dangerous. Mrs. Greeley from the orphan committee stood near the altar holding a ledger against her ribs. Lavender powder and old starch clung sharply to her clothes. "It's the practical choice," she said. "You have no husband, no steady income. The child deserves placement before winter." Placement. As though Lily were freight-waiting shipment east. Evelyn swallowed hard against the ache rising into her throat. "I know what she deserves. Then you know this is necessary." Before Evelyn could answer, the church doors opened behind her. Heavy boots crossed the aisle slowly. Every head turned. The rancher who entered looked tired in the way only hard seasons could make a man look. Dust covered Caleb Mercer's coat. Sweat darkened the collar of his shirt from the afternoon ride. People in town whispered about him constantly lately. Mortgage overdue, cattle dying, ranch collapsing one missed payment at a time. A man holding his land together through stubbornness alone. By autumn, the ranch had begun breathing again. Fresh water strengthened the herd. Trade resumed. The bank investigation spread wider than anyone expected. People now came to Evelyn with questions about ledgers and freight notices. One evening, Clara Bennett visited while Caleb repaired Lily's cradle beside the stove. "That man built shelves because you mentioned needing storage once," Clara observed. "Shelves were practical," Caleb muttered. Clara smiled faintly. "Looks like family to me." The words lingered after she left. That night, Evelyn stood near the barn beneath sharp autumn stars when Caleb joined her at the fence. "The bank offered settlement terms today," he said quietly. "Reduced mortgage." Relief swept through her. "We did it. We did." After a pause, he added, "They also asked whether our arrangement stays temporary." The cold wind moved softly through the pasture grass. Evelyn looked toward the ranch house windows glowing gold in the dark. Lily's cradle upstairs. Thomas laughing near the bunkhouse. Belonging. Then she looked back at him. "What do you want?" His jaw flexed once hard. For the first time since the church, Caleb Mercer looked genuinely afraid. Finally, he answered honestly, "You staying?" Her breath caught. He looked away toward the fields immediately afterward, as though the admission cost him something physical. Evelyn stepped closer. "You never asked me to." "I know." "Why?" His voice lowered rougher than usual. Didn't want obligation mistaken for choice. The truth of that nearly undid her. Caleb. He looked back then, and she saw it plainly at last. Love worn raw by restraint. "I already chose," she whispered. Something broke open softly in his expression. He lifted one hand toward her face, hesitated briefly halfway, then brushed his thumb gently against her cheek. Inside the house, Lily began crying upstairs. Evelyn laughed quietly through sudden tears. Perfect timing. Caleb exhaled something almost like a laugh. "I'll get her." But when he turned toward the porch, Evelyn caught his wrist. Then she kissed him. Simple. Certain. The kind built slowly through shared labor and sleepless nights, and choosing each other long before either dared say it aloud. When they finally separated, Caleb rested his forehead briefly against hers beneath the cold stars. No speeches, no grand declarations, only certainty. Winter arrived hard that year. Snow gathered thick along the porch rails while smoke curled steadily from the chimney each evening. The cattle survived stronger than expected. The mortgage shrank month by month. Inside the house, life settled into rhythms no longer temporary. One morning near Christmas, Evelyn descended the stairs carrying Lily to find Caleb standing beside the stove, holding a tiny pair of leather boots. "She'll need them soon," he muttered. Evelyn touched the soft leather carefully. "You made these?" Thomas helped. "Poorly," Thomas shouted from outside. Caleb ignored him. Lily reached immediately for the boots with delighted little sounds. Evelyn looked around the warm kitchen. Snowlight through frosted windows, coffee and cedar smoke in the air. Home, real home. Caleb glanced toward her then, not guarded anymore, not uncertain. He crossed the kitchen and held out one hand. Plain gesture, irreversible all the same. Evelyn placed her free hand in his without hesitation, and when he drew both her and the child gently against his chest beside the stove, neither of them let go. She arrived carrying a child nobody believed she could keep, and a future already slipping from her hands. He began as a man measuring survival in debts and losses, until he learned that some burdens grow lighter when carried together.